The profoundly moving story I'm about to share with you began on a cold and foggy Monday morning in November, precisely at 7:30, when the autumn mist was still clinging to the city streets, making everything look gray and melancholic and slightly unreal. When Patricia Silva arrived at the imposing three-story mansion of Marcos Almeida, carrying nothing but a single worn canvas bag that contained all her essential possessions, and wearing clothes that had clearly been washed and mended many times but were still clean and presentable, because Patricia took great pride in maintaining her dignity and professional appearance even when circumstances had reduced her to near poverty. Patricia was 43 years old with kind hazel eyes that crinkled at the corners from years of smiling despite hardship, graying brown hair that she wore pulled back in a practical bun, and hands that showed the evidence of decades of hard physical labor caring for others in various capacities, from hospital nursing assistant to home health aide to her current position as private caregiver for wealthy clients who needed round-the-clock care for elderly or disabled family members, but preferred to keep them at home rather than placing them in institutional facilities. Marcos Almeida was a 55-year-old real estate investment mogul who had built an empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars through aggressive acquisition strategies and ruthless business tactics that had earned him enormous wealth, along with a reputation for being cold, calculating, and completely lacking in empathy or human warmth. He lived alone in his massive mansion that was filled with expensive art and furniture and technology, but felt completely sterile and lifeless, like a museum or showroom, rather than an actual home where people lived and loved and created memories together. The reason Patricia had been hired to come work at this mansion was not to care for Marcos himself, who was in perfect physical health despite his advancing age, but rather to provide care for his 82-year-old father, Antonio, who had suffered a severe stroke 6 months earlier that had left him partially paralyzed on his left side, struggling with speech and communication, and requiring extensive assistance with all basic daily activities, from bathing and dressing to eating and moving around the house safely. Marcos had initially tried to convince his father to move into an expensive luxury senior care facility where professionals could provide all necessary medical care and therapy, and where Marcos wouldn't have to deal with the inconvenience and emotional discomfort of having a sick elderly parent living in his home, disrupting his carefully controlled environment and routines. But Antonio had been adamant, despite his limited speech, that he wanted to stay in his son's home, where he had moved after the stroke, because his own small apartment was no longer suitable for someone with his mobility limitations, and Marcos had reluctantly agreed, only because refusing would have looked bad publicly and might have damaged his carefully cultivated image as a successful family man, despite the reality that he had minimal actual relationship with his father and found his presence both inconvenient and uncomfortable. The previous 3 caregivers Marcos had hired for his father had all quit within weeks, unable to tolerate Marcos's demanding and critical nature, his complete lack of appreciation or gratitude for their hard work, his tendency to treat them as servants rather than skilled professionals, and his obvious resentment about having to accommodate his father's needs and the presence of caregiving staff in his pristine mansion. When Patricia rang the doorbell that foggy November morning, she had no illusions about what she was walking into, because the agency had been honest about Marcos's difficult personality and the high turnover rate for this particular position. But Patricia desperately needed this job because she was supporting not just herself, but also her adult son, who had been born with cerebral palsy and required ongoing medical care and therapy that was devastatingly expensive, even with the limited disability benefits he received from the government. The door was answered not by Marcos himself, but by his housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, a stern-faced woman in her 60s who looked Patricia up and down with obvious skepticism before grudgingly allowing her to enter and instructing her to wait in the foyer while she informed Mr. Almeida of her arrival. Patricia stood in that grand grand entrance hall with its soaring ceiling and marble floors and expensive artwork, feeling acutely aware of how shabby and poor she must appear in this setting of extreme wealth and luxury. But she kept her head high and her expression calm and professional because she had learned long ago that dignity comes from within rather than from external circumstances or possessions. Marcos eventually appeared at the top of the curved staircase and descended slowly while looking at his phone rather than acknowledging Patricia directly, clearly demonstrating through his body language that he considered this interaction an interruption and inconvenience rather than an important meeting with someone who would be providing essential care for his vulnerable father. When he finally reached the bottom of the stairs and looked up from his phone, his first words were not a greeting or welcome, but rather a critical comment about Patricia being 7 minutes later than the time specified in her contract, completely ignoring the fact that traffic had been unusually heavy due to the fog and that 7 minutes was hardly a serious delay worthy of immediate criticism at their very first meeting. Patricia apologized calmly and professionally without making excuses or becoming defensive, simply acknowledging that she understood punctuality was important and would ensure she left earlier in future to account for unpredictable traffic conditions. Marcos then launched into a lengthy monologue about his expectations and requirements, speaking in a cold, business-like tone as if he were briefing an employee about a corporate project rather than discussing the care of his elderly father, who was a human being with feelings and needs and dignity that deserved respect and compassion. He explained that his father required assistance with all activities of daily living, that physical therapy exercises needed to be performed twice daily to maintain muscle tone and prevent further deterioration, that medications needed to be administered on a strict schedule without any errors or oversights, that his father's room and bathroom needed to be kept impeccably clean at all times, that meals needed to be prepared according to the specific dietary restrictions provided by his father's doctors, and that above all, Patricia needed to ensure that his father's care and needs did not intrude upon or disrupt Marcos's own schedule and routines and professional life. At no point during this entire briefing did Marcos say his father's name or refer to him as a person, rather than just using impersonal pronouns, and at no point did he ask Patricia anything about her qualifications or experience or approach to caregiving or whether she had any questions or concerns about the position. After completing his instructions, Marcos led Patricia upstairs to the room where his father Antonio was staying, a large bedroom that had been converted into something resembling a hospital room with a medical bed and various equipment and supplies, but very little in the way of personal touches or comfort items that would make the space feel like home rather than institutional care. Antonio was sitting in a wheelchair near the window, looking out at the foggy garden, and when he turned at the sound of the door opening, Patricia could see immediately the profound sadness and resignation in his eyes, along with something else that looked almost like hope when he saw a new person entering who might potentially bring some warmth and human connection into his isolated existence. Patricia walked directly over to Antonio rather than standing by the door with Marcos, and she knelt down so she was at eye level with him rather than towering above him in his wheelchair, and she introduced herself warmly and respectfully, using his name, and looking directly into his eyes while she spoke. She told him that her name was Patricia and that she would be caring for him starting today, and that she hoped they would become friends as well as caregiver and patient, because in her experience, the best care happened when there was genuine mutual respect and affection rather than just clinical professional distance. She asked him how he was feeling today and whether there was anything specific he needed or wanted right away, speaking to him as an intelligent adult rather than talking over him or around him as if he were incapable of understanding or participating in conversations about his own care. Antonio's eyes filled with tears at this simple demonstration of respect and kindness, and he struggled to form words with his stroke-affected speech, managing to say in slurred but understandable syllables that he was glad she was there and that he had been lonely and uncomfortable with the previous caregivers who had treated him like a burden rather than a person. Marcos watched this interaction with obvious impatience and discomfort, clearly unused to seeing his father treated with such warmth and dignity, and he cut the conversation short by informing Patricia that he had important meetings and needed to leave immediately, and that she should refer to the extensive written instructions he had prepared if she had any questions about procedures or protocols. He left without saying goodbye to either Patricia or his father, and the sound of his expensive shoes clicking rapidly down the marble stairs and then the front door slamming echoed through the mansion, emphasizing the emptiness and coldness that pervaded this wealthy but emotionally bankrupt household. Patricia turned her full attention back to Antonio and spent the next hour just talking with him and getting to know him as a person, learning about his life before the stroke, when he had worked as a teacher for 40 years, educating thousands of children in a public school in a poor neighborhood, about his late wife who had died from cancer 15 years ago and whom he still missed every single day, about his complicated relationship with his son Marcos, who had become someone Antonio barely recognized and didn't particularly like even though he loved him as his child. Over the following days and weeks, Patricia provided not just competent professional medical care for Antonio, but also brought warmth and human connection and genuine affection that transformed his daily existence from mere survival into something approaching actual living. She helped him with his physical therapy exercises while encouraging him gently and celebrating small victories. She prepared meals that were nutritious according to his dietary restrictions, but also delicious and presented attractively rather than just functional. She kept his room spotlessly clean, but also added small personal touches like fresh flowers and family photographs she had found stored in boxes and pleasant music playing softly in the background. Most importantly, she talked with him constantly throughout the day, sharing stories from her own life and asking about his memories and opinions and preferences, treating him as someone whose thoughts and feelings mattered rather than just a body that needed mechanical tending. Patricia learned that Antonio had been a passionate teacher who truly loved his students, especially the struggling ones from difficult home situations, that he had once dreamed of writing a book about his teaching philosophy and experiences, but had never found the time or confidence to actually pursue that dream, that he felt profound regret about the way his relationship with Marcos had deteriorated over the years as his son became increasingly obsessed with wealth and status and lost sight of the values of compassion and service and human connection that Antonio had tried to instill in him throughout his childhood. Antonio shared with Patricia his memories of Marcos as a sweet, sensitive boy who cried when he saw homeless people on the street and who wanted to become a doctor or teacher so he could help others, and his sadness about how that boy had transformed into a cold, ruthless businessman who seemed to care only about money and power and who treated his own father as an inconvenient obligation rather than someone to love and honor and spend time with. Patricia also shared her own story with Antonio, telling him about her son Daniel, who was now 24 years old and who had been born with cerebral palsy that affected his mobility and fine motor control but left his mind sharp and his spirit unbroken. She described the challenges of raising a child with significant disabilities as a single mother after her husband left when Daniel was only 2 years old, unable or unwilling to handle the demands and stress of caring for a disabled child. The years of therapy and medical appointments and fighting with insurance companies and school systems to get Daniel the services and support he needed and deserved, the financial struggles that had forced her to work multiple jobs simultaneously just to keep them housed and fed while covering medical expenses. She talked about her pride in Daniel, who, despite all his physical limitations, had graduated from high school and was now taking online college courses in computer programming and web design, working toward building a career that would allow him independence and purpose, even if his body would never cooperate with his dreams of physical activities or traditional employment paths. As Antonio listened to Patricia's stories and witnessed her unwavering dedication both to caring for him and to supporting her son despite enormous challenges, he found himself feeling something he hadn't felt in years, which was genuine admiration and respect for another human being's character and strength. Patricia had every reason to be bitter and angry about the unfair hand life had dealt her, but instead she approached each day with gratitude and kindness and determination to make positive differences wherever she could. She never complained about the difficulty of her work or the long hours or the low pay relative to the emotional and physical demands of caregiving, never made Antonio feel like a burden or obligation, never showed resentment about Marcos's coldness and lack of appreciation, or about the uncomfortable living situation of working in a house where she was clearly not welcome or valued by the employer, even though the person she was caring for cherished her presence. Marcos himself barely interacted with Patricia beyond occasional critical comments about minor things he claimed were not meeting his exacting standards, and he continued to avoid spending any significant time with his father, even though they were living in the same house. Patricia observed that Marcos would sometimes stand outside his father's room, as if wanting to enter, but then would turn away without going in, clearly struggling with some internal conflict about engaging emotionally with his sick father, but unable or unwilling to overcome whatever barriers prevented genuine connection. She noticed that on the rare occasions when Marcos did briefly check on his father, usually when Patricia was elsewhere in the house, the conversations were awkward and stilted, with Marcos asking only perfunctory questions about medical matters and Antonio giving short, sad answers that suggested he had long ago given up hope of real communication with his son. The breakthrough moment that would eventually change everything came approximately 2 months after Patricia had started working in the Almeida household, on a Saturday afternoon when Marcos was supposedly working in his home office, but had emerged to get coffee and overheard Patricia reading aloud to Antonio from a book of poetry that she had discovered among his belongings. Patricia had learned that Antonio loved poetry and had actually written some poems himself years ago, and she had encouraged him to share his writing with her, which he had done with touching vulnerability and obvious hunger for someone to appreciate and validate his creative expression that he had kept hidden for decades. She was reading one of his poems aloud, a beautiful meditation on time and memory, and the ways we carry loved ones in our hearts even after death, and her voice was warm and expressive, bringing the words to life in a way that honored the emotion and craft behind them. Marcos stood frozen in the hallway outside his father's room, listening to Patricia read his father's words, and he felt something crack inside his chest as he heard genuine beauty and depth of feeling in poetry, written by a man he had dismissed as simple and unsophisticated, a man whose primary value in Marcos's mind had been reduced to biological connection rather than recognizing him as a complete person with interior richness and creative gifts. When Patricia finished reading the poem, and Antonio's voice could be heard saying in his slow, stroke-affected speech how much it meant to have someone who actually listened and understood and appreciated his work, Marcos felt ashamed in a way he couldn't remember feeling since childhood when his father had caught him lying about something, and the disappointment in Antonio's eyes had been more painful than any punishment could have been. Marcos returned quietly to his office without getting the coffee he had come for, and he sat at his desk staring at nothing while thoughts and feelings he had been suppressing for years began forcing their way into his consciousness, demanding attention and acknowledgement. He thought about how he had been treating his father with cold duty rather than love, how he had been seeing Patricia as a mere employee rather than as a remarkable woman who brought light and warmth and human dignity to her work, how he had built his entire adult life around accumulating wealth and power while losing sight of everything that actually mattered in terms of human connection and meaning and legacy. He remembered his father reading to him when he was a child, patient hours spent helping him with homework and teaching him to ride a bike and attending his school events and telling him stories about the students he taught and the importance of kindness and using whatever gifts you had to help others rather than just enriching yourself. Somewhere along the path from that childhood to his current position as a wealthy, successful businessman, Marcos had betrayed everything his father had tried to teach him and had become someone his younger self would have despised. That evening, Marcos did something he hadn't done in months, which was to knock on his father's door and ask if he could come in and sit for a while. Antonio looked shocked and wary, but gestured weakly with his good hand, indicating Marcos should enter. Patricia tactfully excused herself to give them privacy, though Antonio's expression suggested he would have preferred her to stay as a buffer against the awkwardness of interacting with his emotionally distant son. Marcos pulled up a chair next to his father's wheelchair and sat in uncomfortable silence for several minutes, trying to find words for things he had kept buried for so long. Finally, he began speaking in a voice that trembled slightly with suppressed emotion, saying that he had overheard Patricia reading his father's poetry that afternoon and had been moved by the beauty and depth of the writing, admitting that he hadn't known his father wrote poetry or had any creative talents beyond his teaching career, because Marcos had never bothered to ask or pay attention to his father as a complete person rather than just a parent figure. Marcos continued with difficulty, but growing determination to speak honestly, saying that he realized he had been a terrible son, especially in recent years, and even more so since his father's stroke, that he had allowed his obsession with business success to crowd out everything human and meaningful in his life, including his relationship with his father, that he had been treating Antonio's presence in his home as an inconvenience rather than a precious opportunity to spend time with the man who had given him life and raised him and taught him values that Marcos had abandoned, but now deeply regretted losing. He apologized not with empty words, but with genuine emotion and vulnerability, acknowledging specific ways he had failed and hurt his father, and asking if there might be a chance to rebuild some kind of authentic relationship during whatever time they had left together, because Marcos was finally recognizing that wealth and power meant nothing if you had no one who actually loved you or whom you loved in return. Antonio listened to his son's words with tears streaming down his face, and when Marcos finished speaking, Antonio reached out with his functioning right hand and placed it on Marcos's hand in a gesture of forgiveness and connection. He struggled to speak through his compromised speech, managing to say with great effort that he had been waiting for years to see some sign that his son still had a heart beneath all the corporate armor, that he had never stopped loving Marcos even when he didn't like the person Marcos had become, that he would welcome the chance to know his son again as a real person rather than just exchanging perfunctory pleasantries and business updates. They sat together for over an hour that evening, Marcos listening as his father shared memories from when Marcos was young, and Antonio explained what had happened to change his sweet, sensitive boy into such a cold, calculating man, and Marcos beginning to unpack and examine the choices and experiences and pressures that had shaped his adult identity and led him so far away from his original values and authentic self. Patricia observed the gradual transformation in Marcos over the following weeks and months as he began spending regular time with his father, initially awkward and forced, but becoming more natural and genuine as they rebuilt trust and connection. Marcos started asking Patricia questions about his father's daily routines and preferences and moods, actually wanting to understand and support his father's well-being rather than just ensuring the care met minimum standards. He began reading to his father in the evenings, sometimes, continuing the book of poetry or starting novels they could discuss together. He asked Patricia to help him find and frame photographs from his childhood that showed happy family memories, and these pictures were hung in Antonio's room, replacing the sterile, impersonal art that had previously adorned the walls. Most significantly, Marcos started expressing genuine appreciation and gratitude to Patricia for the extraordinary care and compassion she provided, acknowledging that she was doing far more than just fulfilling the basic requirements of her job, and that her presence had brought life and warmth to both his father and eventually, by extension, to Marcos himself. As Marcos spent more time actually talking with Patricia rather than just issuing instructions, he began learning about her life and her son and the challenges she faced and the remarkable strength and grace with which she handled enormous difficulties. He was particularly struck when he learned that Patricia was taking online courses herself during her limited free time, working toward getting certified as a registered nurse, because she wanted to expand her skills and open up better employment opportunities that would provide higher income and benefits to better support Daniel. He learned that she was doing this despite working over 60 hours per week as a caregiver, despite being exhausted constantly from the physical and emotional demands of her work, despite having almost no money for tuition and books and other educational expenses because everything she earned beyond bare survival needs went toward Daniel's ongoing medical care and therapy and educational support. Marcos found himself thinking constantly about Patricia's situation and recognizing the profound unfairness of a world where someone with her work ethic and dedication and skills had to struggle so desperately while he had more wealth than he could ever spend accumulated through business practices that often involved exploiting people's labor and needs. He began to understand on a deeper level what his father had been trying to teach him throughout his childhood about human dignity and the moral imperative to help others and the emptiness of success that comes at the expense of compassion and justice. One evening after Patricia had left for the night and Marcos was sitting with his father, he asked Antonio's advice about something he was considering doing, but wasn't sure if it would be appropriate or if it might be perceived as charity that would offend Patricia's pride and independence. Antonio listened carefully as Marcos explained his idea, and then he smiled broadly, which was remarkable because he smiled so rarely these days, and he told his son that he was seeing glimpses of the boy he remembered and the man he had always hoped Marcos would become. He advised that the most important thing was to make sure Patricia understood that any help offered came from genuine respect and care rather than pity or guilt, and that she needed to feel empowered and valued rather than diminished by accepting assistance. With his father's encouragement, Marcos made a decision that would change multiple lives, including his own, in profound and lasting ways. The next day, Marcos asked Patricia if they could have a serious conversation about something important, and he could see the immediate worry and fear in her eyes as she clearly assumed she was about to be fired or criticized for some failure. He quickly reassured her that this was actually about something positive, and he asked her to sit down and really listen without interrupting because he needed to say several things that were important to him. Marcos began by telling Patricia that she was, quite simply, the most remarkable person he had ever had the privilege of knowing, that her kindness and dedication and strength and integrity put his own character to shame, and that she had taught him through her example what it meant to live with genuine values and compassion, rather than just pursuing selfish accumulation of wealth and power. He said that his father had told him about her educational goals and her dreams of becoming a registered nurse, and that Marcos wanted to help make that dream a reality by paying for all her tuition and books and fees for a full nursing program at the best school in the city. Before Patricia could protest or refuse, Marcos continued quickly by explaining that this was not charity and that she shouldn't feel uncomfortable accepting help because she had already given far more value to his family than money could measure through the care she had provided for his father and the way she had helped facilitate healing and reconciliation between Marcos and Antonio. He added that he was also establishing a trust fund for Daniel that would cover all his ongoing medical needs and therapy and educational expenses for the rest of his life, regardless of what happened with Patricia's employment, because no young person with Daniel's abilities and determination should have his potential limited simply because of the financial accident of being born into a family without wealth and with expensive medical needs. Marcos emphasized that accepting these gifts wouldn't change Patricia's job or their working relationship, and that she should continue caring for Antonio for as long as she wanted to and was able to, but that she deserved the opportunity to pursue her professional goals without the crushing burden of financial stress that had been limiting her options and draining her energy for so many years. Patricia sat stunned and silent as Marcos explained all this, tears streaming down her face as she struggled to process this completely unexpected generosity that would fundamentally change her life and her son's future in ways she had never dared to dream might be possible. When she finally found her voice, she asked Marcos why he was doing this for someone who was essentially a stranger stranger and an employee rather than family or friend, and Marcos answered with complete honesty that she had become far more than just an employee through her presence in his life, that she had reminded him through her example of who he once aspired to be and could still become if he chose to prioritize values over accumulation, that helping her and Daniel was actually a way of helping himself by finally using his wealth for something meaningful that aligned with the principles his father had tried to teach him decades ago. Patricia accepted these gifts with gratitude and grace. And true to Marcos's promise, it didn't change the fundamental nature of their relationship, but rather deepened the mutual respect and affection that had been growing between them. Patricia continued providing exceptional care for Antonio while also beginning her nursing program, and Marcos and his father both supported her educational goals by being flexible with scheduling and by offering encouragement when coursework was challenging or exhausting on top of her demanding caregiving work. Daniel began receiving therapies and medical interventions that had previously been financially impossible, and his physical function and independence improved dramatically, while his online college courses progressed successfully toward an eventual degree in computer science that would enable him to build a career working from home, accommodating his physical limitations. The relationship between Marcos and his father continued to deepen and heal over the months that followed, with both men opening up to each other about regrets and hopes and fears in ways they had never done before. Antonio began to show improvement in his physical condition as well, not because his stroke damage had magically reversed, but because having reasons to live and people who cared about him gave him motivation to work harder at his therapy and rehabilitation. He started speaking more clearly through sheer determination and practice. He regained some additional mobility and strength through consistent physical therapy exercise, and most importantly, he seemed to come back to life emotionally and mentally, as depression and isolation were replaced by engagement and connection and purpose. One of the most touching developments was when Patricia brought Daniel to meet Antonio, understanding that these two men who had both faced significant physical challenges and limitations would likely connect and understand each other in ways that fully able-bodied people might not. The friendship that formed between elderly Antonio and young Daniel was beautiful and mutually beneficial, with Antonio serving as a kind of grandfather figure sharing wisdom and perspective earned through decades of life experience, and Daniel bringing youthful energy and enthusiasm and technology skills that opened up new possibilities for Antonio to engage with the wider world despite his physical limitations. Daniel helped Antonio set up a blog where he could share his poetry and reflections about life and aging and disability, and the blog gradually attracted a following of readers who were moved by Antonio's honest and eloquent writing about universal human experiences. The romantic dimension of the story began developing gradually and naturally between Marcos and Patricia as their friendship deepened through countless hours of conversation and shared experiences caring for Antonio and celebrating Daniel's achievements and supporting each other through various challenges, both practical and emotional. Neither of them rushed toward defining or labeling what was happening between them, both being cautious people who had experienced enough disappointment and loss to value building a solid foundation of trust and genuine compatibility before allowing themselves to hope for lasting romantic partnership. But the affection and attraction were undeniable, visible to everyone around them, including Antonio and Daniel, who both encouraged the relationship while also gently teasing Marcos and Patricia about their mutual obviousness and hesitation. The moment when their relationship shifted explicitly from friendship to acknowledged romance came during a hospital scare when Antonio experienced some concerning symptoms that required emergency evaluation to rule out another stroke or other serious medical event. Patricia and Marcos rushed Antonio to the hospital and spent a terrifying night waiting for test results and sitting by his bedside while he slept restlessly, both of them confronting the reality that Antonio was elderly and fragile, and that despite all the progress and healing he had experienced, he might not have unlimited time remaining with them. In those long, quiet hospital hours, Marcos and Patricia talked with complete honesty about their feelings and their fears and what they meant to each other, and they acknowledged that they had fallen deeply in love without planning to or even fully realizing when it had happened. Antonio recovered from that scare and was released from the hospital with orders for modified activity and monitoring, but no permanent additional damage. And when he learned upon returning home that Marcos and Patricia had finally admitted their feelings and were beginning an official romantic relationship, he was absolutely delighted and told them both that this was the best medicine he could possibly receive. He said that he had been hoping and praying that they would find each other romantically because they were so clearly perfect for each other and because both of them deserved happiness after years of loneliness and struggle, and that knowing his son had found someone as remarkable as Patricia gave Antonio peace about his own eventual death, because he would know Marcos wouldn't be alone and would have someone who truly loved him and would keep him connected to his better self. Marcos and Patricia dated seriously for a year, taking time to build their relationship on the solid foundation of friendship and shared values, while also integrating their lives practically and ensuring that Daniel and Antonio were comfortable with and supportive of the changes happening in their family structure. Marcos proposed to Patricia in a thoughtful way that honored both the seriousness of their commitment and the journey they had traveled together, asking not just Patricia but also Daniel and his father for their blessing and support, making clear that he was hoping to join their family and community rather than expecting Patricia to leave behind her roots and relationships to join his solitary, wealthy world. The wedding was a joyful celebration that brought together Marcos's business associates and Patricia's extended family and community, including many of Antonio's former students who came to honor the beloved teacher who had made such positive impacts on their lives decades ago. Antonio served as Marcos's best man despite his physical limitations, moving slowly with his cane but standing straight and proud next to his son, and Daniel rolled his wheelchair down the aisle to give Patricia away with obvious emotion and pride. The ceremony and reception emphasized values of community and service, and using whatever resources and gifts you had to make positive differences rather than just accumulating for yourself, and many guests commented that they had never been to a wedding that felt so authentically meaningful and emotionally genuine, rather than just being expensive spectacle. Today, 4 years after that foggy November morning when Patricia arrived at Marcos's mansion carrying nothing but an old canvas bag and hoping desperately that this difficult job might work out, despite the warnings about her demanding employer, Patricia and Marcos are happily married and have created a blended family that includes Antonio, who continues to live with them and has become a cherished grandfather figure, not just to Daniel, but also to the community of young people he mentors. Through online writing groups, Patricia completed her nursing degree and now works part-time at a clinic that serves low-income families, using her skills to help people who remind her of her former self, struggling to access quality health care and compassionate treatment. Marcos has fundamentally transformed his business approach to focus on ethical practices and community development, using his wealth and influence to create affordable housing and support social programs rather than just maximizing profit at any cost. The deepest truth of this story isn't just about personal transformation or romance across class divides, though those elements are certainly central and important. The real lesson is about seeing people's full humanity and worth regardless of their current circumstances or job titles, about recognizing that someone who arrives at your door with nothing material might actually be carrying riches of character and wisdom and strength that could transform your life if you open yourself to receiving what they offer. It teaches us that caregiving is not diminished or servile work, but rather sacred labor that requires extraordinary skill and dedication and compassion, that the people who care for our most vulnerable family members deserve profound respect and support rather than being treated as mere service providers whose own struggles and dreams are invisible and irrelevant. This story reminds us that it's never too late to recognize we've been living according to false values, to open our eyes to realities and people we've been overlooking or dismissing, to choose compassion and connection over accumulation and isolation, to use whatever privilege and resources we have to create positive impact rather than just hoarding more for ourselves. It shows us that real wealth comes from authentic relationships and living with integrity rather than from bank account balances, that the legacy that matters isn't buildings with our names on them, but rather the lives we've touched and helped, and the values we've modeled and passed on to others. Most fundamentally, it teaches that we're all interconnected, and that everyone we encounter has something to teach us if we approach them with curiosity and respect, rather than judgment and indifference. That the person who seems to need our help might actually be the one who saves us from the poverty of spirit that comes from living without genuine love and purpose. If this story moved you and made you think about how you see and value the people who provide services and care in your life and community, please leave a like on this video to let me know this content resonates with you and encourages you to treat everyone with the dignity and respect they deserve. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss future stories about transformation and redemption, about seeing beyond surface appearances, about choosing compassion, and using whatever resources you have to help others rather than just accumulating more for yourself. And please share in the comments your own experiences with caregivers or service providers who made profound impacts on your life, or times when someone you initially overlooked or underestimated turned out to be exactly what you needed, because your stories inspire all of us to pay better attention to the people around us and to approach each interaction with openness to the possibility of genuine connection and mutual transformation.